Hello, government students. Today we're going to talk about congressional rules, controversies, and shenanigans. What's a shenanigan, you ask? Well, a shenanigan is mischief. And a lot of times that the rules that exist in the different chambers of Congress will result in controversies or shenanigans or mischief. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, to understand these rules, we need to look at the characteristics of each chamber. So the House of Representatives has more rigid rules than the Senate, and the House leadership has more power than the Senate leadership does. The House is very quick to act on potential legislation. The Senate acts much more slowly. The House has fewer constituents than the Senate does. Remember, a constituent is someone who is represented by a person in the government. So we are the constituents of our senators and our representatives in the House. And of course, that's true because the Senate represents an entire state, whereas the House of Representatives is divided up into districts, so there are multiple districts within a state, fewer constituents typically in a district than there would be in an entire state. Senators also have more prestige than House members, and again, that's probably because they represent an entire state. They have more constituents. You'll tend to see senators interviewed on the news programs more frequently than you'll see members of the House of Representatives. That goes along with that prestige factor. And this is a real important one. In the Senate, there is no limit to the amount of time that a senator can be up on the stage conducting a debate. House members, on the other hand, are only given a few minutes to debate. And you may recall that we talked a little bit about the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee in the House of Representatives establishes how long a member will be allowed to speak about a bill when they're debating it. And typically that's only a few minutes, but there's no such limit in the Senate. A senator can theoretically go on and on and on and never stop. And that leads to something called the filibuster. The filibuster only happens in the Senate, and this is when a senator will continue to speak and not allow a debate to end. Again, it's only in the Senate, not the House of Representatives, because it is only the Senate where you have an unlimited amount of time to debate. In the House, you're given a very strict limit. Typically, a filibuster would be used to prevent or more likely delay voting on legislation. Obviously, you can't just talk forever, so it's not likely that you would be able to prevent legislation from coming up to a vote, but you may be able to delay it, and the purpose of that delay would be to try to negotiate with others to maybe sway them to vote in the way you would like them to vote. There have been some pretty famous filibusters, very long filibusters in the history of the Senate. I thought it might be fun to look at a few of them. You do not have to write these down. This isn't going to be on a test, but you may find it interesting. So, for example, Huey Long of Louisiana back in the 1930s, he actually stood up on the podium and spent 15 hours talking. Well, what are you going to talk about for 15 hours? Well, there's no rule that says you have to talk about what the Senate is actually debating. You can talk about anything. So Huey Long read Shakespeare and cookbooks for much of that 15 hours that he spent speaking. Strom Thurmond, he beat Huey Long significantly. Strom Thurmond actually spoke for over 24 hours. Again, what can you talk about? Well, he read the Constitution. He read the Declaration of Independence. He read excerpts out of Tom Sawyer. I don't know if he read the entire book or not. He might have for 15, if he had 24 hours. He even read his grandmother's biscuit recipe. He was up there for more than a single day. Can you imagine that? Sometimes, though, there have been filibusters which were a team effort. And the longest filibuster ever was a team effort when Southern senators filibustered for 57 days against the Voting Rights Act of 1964. It's an interesting story. They did not want to allow this Voting Rights Act to come to a vote. As you can imagine, in the South, a lot of African Americans were prevented from voting through things such as poll taxes and literacy tests. And Lyndon Johnson was president. He actually called up a leader of that filibuster who was a close friend of his, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia. They were close friends, and Johnson persuaded Russell to allow that filibuster to come to an end, basically saying, you know, history's going to remember you, and you can be remembered as a racist, or you can be remembered as a person of vision and courage, and the person who was willing to do the right thing. And Johnson persuaded Russell to use his influence to bring that filibuster to an end and allow the Voting Rights Act to pass. There have been some very important changes to the filibuster, very important changes, and I want you to make sure you take good notes on this. We now have a two-track system where you can consider in the Senate more than one bill at a time. Back in the old days, you could only consider one bill at a time, so if someone was filibustering, that would bring all the business in the Senate to a screeching halt. Now you can consider more than one bill, so the business of the Senate can continue even if there is a filibuster. But this is the really important part here. Actually speaking is no longer necessary to have a filibuster. Now all you have to do is declare a filibuster or threaten the filibuster. So the way that works today is, let's say there's a piece of legislation that you do not like. You would go to your Senate Majority Leader or Senate Minority Leader, whichever the case may be, depending on your party, and you would simply tell that person, I'm declaring a filibuster. At this point, the legislation stops unless you can bring the debate to an end through something called a cloture vote. Cloture happens if 60 senators vote to end debate. If 60 senators vote to end debate, then you will be able to force that filibuster to end and vote on the bill. Now think about this though, 60 senators, there's 100 senators total, 50 states, 2 senators per state. Getting 60 senators is not easy, especially when you have, as we do today, 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. As I'm doing this lesson, the Senate is evenly divided with the Vice President in the role of President of the Senate being able to cast a tie-breaking vote. But it's not going to be easy at all to get 10 senators of the opposing party to jump ship and vote with the other party to get that 60 votes. So the result of this idea of filibusters no longer requiring actual speaking but just declaring it and requiring cloture means that very little important legislation can get through the Senate. A lot of bills die in the Senate because they cannot get this supermajority of 60 senators to vote for cloture. So remember this cloture idea. It's very important, and it's a very controversial thing. There have been a lot of moves to try to revise this filibuster and cloture rule, and it always comes up short when they try to bring this to an end, because if they do bring it to an end, it's going to definitely reduce the power of senators to stop legislation that they do not like. Okay, another one is gerrymandering, and we've talked about gerrymandering a little bit in the past. It is designing congressional districts to favor a single candidate or political party. The important thing to remember is that these districts are drawn by state legislatures. Even though we're talking about the districts in the United States House of Representatives, it is the state legislatures that draw them. Therefore, whichever party has a majority in the state legislature, and in Illinois, of course, that is our General Assembly, that party can gerrymander U.S. House districts. There's just a couple of rules that they have to follow. The districts must be contiguous, and according to Westbury versus Sanders, the districts must be roughly equal in population. We've already discussed that. And the districts cannot be drawn to accomplish racial discrimination. In other words, you can't use race as a factor in drawing those districts. That's very hard to prove, however. There have been several attempts to try to overturn gerrymandered districts based on racial discrimination, but it's extremely difficult to prove that racial discrimination is the cause of the gerrymander or the purpose of the gerrymander. So usually these challenges are not successful. Here's the latest congressional district map for Illinois based on the 2020 census. Illinois now has 17 congressional districts. You can see how crowded and small those districts are in the Chicago metropolitan area. And that, of course, is again because of Westbury versus Sanders. All districts must be roughly equal in population. But I really wanted to point out a couple of districts here. Notice the one in central Illinois that stretches from East St. Louis. Very thin line to include a big chunk of Springfield, Decatur, and Champaign, where the University of Illinois is. This district is a gerrymandered district meant to favor Democrats by putting Democratic Champaign, Democratic Springfield, and Democratic St. Louis all together to negate the power of the rural areas in that area that would tend to go Republican. And they try to get all those Republicans squeezed into just a few districts like this big purple one. And this green one here, which is the district that if Adam Kinzinger were to run again for Congress, that would be his district that he would run in. And look at how this district here that is represented by Sherry Bustos is severely gerrymandered as well, including Democratic chunk of Peoria, a little bit of Democratic chunk of Bloomington Normal area, the Quad Cities, which tends to go Democratic, and the Democratic parts of Rockford. Again, this is to negate the power of Republicans that live in the more rural areas of northern and even central Illinois. So Illinois has certainly been gerrymandered to favor Democrats and squeezing Republicans in as few districts as possible. Other states where there is a majority Republican in the legislature, which actually is in more states than not, those states do the same thing, except that they draw their districts to favor Republicans. Pennsylvania is a case in point. North Carolina has been very, very effective at gerrymandering their districts. Texas has been very effective. And I'll give you a clue how this, the results of this kind of gerrymandering. Illinois probably is about 55% Democratic, 45% Republican. And yet the districts as they are drawn today will probably mean that there will be 12 Democrats serving Illinois in Congress and only 5 Republicans. The state of Texas is very close as well, about 55 to 45 as well. And yet they have about 75% of their districts are Republican, even though only about 55% of the state is Republican. So it really does skew the way Congress looks. Next topic, seniority. The longer you serve in Congress, the more likely you are to chair a committee, those standing committees like the Agriculture Committee, Commerce Committee, Armed Services Committee. This gives more power to those that have the seniority in Congress. And this results in a lot more campaign donations going to those with seniority. And that means that, people who vote their long-time representative out of office, they're going to get a new representative, but that person will not have a lot of power. And a lot of people don't like that it gives these people who've been in Congress just way more power perhaps than they should have. And that gets to the idea of term limits. Should we have term limits? Well, remember this word incumbent, where the incumbent is someone who currently holds political office. Incumbents are rarely voted out of office, very rarely. And as a result, they get all the seniority and all the power. And so a lot of people think there should be term limits. So, the fear is that long-serving congressmen may owe special interests and large donors, favors. And again, the seniority system gives these people a lot more power than relatively new congressmen will have. And can you think of any arguments against term limits, though? I can. If you don't like the guy, vote him out. That's the argument against term limits. No one forces you to keep someone in office. You can always vote them out if you want to. Okay, last topic is earmarks. Earmarks is also called riders. They're the same thing. Make sure you know both terms. And an earmark or a rider is provision added to a bill that is unrelated to the initial purpose of the bill. It rides on the back of the bill. So, for example, there was a bridge to nowhere that was funded on a bill that provided relief to Hurricane Katrina victims down in Louisiana and Mississippi back in the early 2000s. Hurricane Katrina wiped out a big chunk of Louisiana and Mississippi. We wanted to provide aid to those areas, and the congressional delegation in Alaska added a provision to provide a bridge in Alaska that literally went nowhere. It crossed a river and basically no other roads or towns were up there. So that's an earmark. They're really just intended to bring money and jobs to a state or to a district that's unrelated, though, to the bill that the rider appears on. And we call this kind of spending pork barrel spending. These riders or earmarks result in pork barrel spending, which favors spending that favors a particular district. Here's a little thing that kind of shows that riders probably aren't that big a deal, or earmarks, very small portion, but they are there. And with that, we're going to close this